Hong Kong, 1943. A 15-year-old boy was coughing up blood, bloody streaks in his phlegm, and his chest felt like someone was carving it out with a knife, inch by inch. His father had died of the same disease just 3 months earlier, tuberculosis, a death sentence for the poor in those days. Now, death handed him that same death sentence. The X-ray showed his lungs riddled with holes, like withered leaves eaten through by insects. No money for hospitalization, no money for medicine, no family to rely on. His mother and younger siblings were far away in Chaozhou. All he had left were an empty coffin his father had left behind and a few old books. At this very moment, this skeletal, thin young man made a decision. He didn't say, "I don't want to die." What he said was, "I cannot die." One word different, a world apart. Don't want to die is fear speaking. It's the body's instinct. It's the futile struggle of a drowning man. And "I cannot die" is the will declaring war, the mission roaring out. A young man pushed to the edge of the abyss, gripping fate by the throat with his teeth. He began to save himself. Every morning before dawn, he'd climb to the mountaintop and roar at the rising sun, training his lung capacity in the most primitive way possible. When he caught a cold, he drank salt water. When he was hungry, he'd go to restaurants and write letters home for the cooks in exchange for a bowl of fish scraps soup that nobody wanted. A year later, his tuberculosis was cured. 7 years later, this teenager, who once couldn't even afford medicine, scraped together 50,000 Hong Kong dollars, started his first entrepreneurial venture in Hong Kong's most dilapidated factory. 3 years later, he became a multi-millionaire. 30 years later, he became Asia's richest man. This man's name is Li Ka-shing. Welcome to the Soft Crash. I'm Fanko. Today, what I want to talk about is not that business titan standing atop the pinnacle of wealth, looking down upon all. I want to tell you about that 15-year-old boy, that child coughing up blood on his sickbed, that Teahouse errand boy, that poor nephew looked down upon by his uncle, that young man who bet everything he had in a dilapidated factory. What I want to tell you is, just how far does fate have to push a person before they grow fangs? Ready? Then let's start from the beginning. Before we talk about Li Ka-shing, we need to first discuss his family, because only by understanding where he came from can you grasp how that almost obsessive will to survive and hunger to win of his later years actually took root and grew. The whole matter of Li Ka-shing's ancestral roots is quite interesting in itself. If you search online, most sources will tell you he's from Chaozhou, Guangdong. That's not wrong, he was indeed born in Chaozhou. But if you trace back through the family graves, back several generations, you'll find a man named Li Mingshan. This Mr. Li Mingshan came from Jiaozhuo, Henan, and was a martial arts master. During the late Ming and early Qing dynasties, he fled famine all the way from Jiaozhuo, first escaping to Putian, Fujian. After staying in Putian for 18 years, he continued migrating south and eventually settled in Chaozhou, Guangdong. I actually measured the distance from Putian to Chaozhou, over 370 kilometers. In that era, there were no high-speed trains, no cars. They relied entirely on their own 2 legs. You can imagine for yourself what the journey was like. Of course, this is just one version of the story. There's another account claiming that Li Ka-shing's ancestors originally came from Shanghang County in Longyan City, Fujian Province. So how did the Jiaozhuo connection come about when there's absolutely no link to Henan's Jiaozhuo? It's because a few years ago, a stone tablet was unearthed in Jiaozhuo, inscribed with Li Mingshan's name and some information. But there are also people saying this is just a far-fetched connection. So which version is actually true? To be honest, We can't confirm it 100% either. But there's one figure both sides acknowledge: this Li Ka-shing. Everyone acknowledges him as the founding ancestor of Li Ka-shing's lineage entering Chaozhou. So why bring all this up? It's to show you one thing. Starting from several hundred years ago, Li Ka-shing's family has been constantly migrating. From the Central Plains to Fujian, from Fujian to Guangdong, from Guangdong to Hong Kong. Behind every migration was a story of "we could no longer survive." But contrary to what many people imagine, Li Ka-shing's family was by no means from humble peasant origins. On the contrary, this was absolutely a distinguished scholarly family. A few generations down the line, when it came to Li Ka-shing's great-grandfather Li Pengwan, he was a tribute student, selected once every 12 years during the Qing dynasty. He was recommended to the Imperial College and later became an official in the capital. But supposedly, he didn't get along too well with Empress Dowager Cixi. He was a bit too outspoken and righteous. The old Buddha didn't like him and told him to get lost. He returned to his hometown in his teens after being stripped of his position. You see, there was this rebellious streak in his bones from the very beginning. By the next generation, Li Ka-shing's great-uncle was also a tribute student. His grandfather, Li Shaofan, was a Shukai scholar who later established his own private academy. But because he supported the New Culture movement, he fell out with the nationalist government, and the academy ultimately couldn't continue operating. 3 generations of scholars, 3 generations of those who refused to give up. By Li Ka-shing's father's generation, they were still intellectuals. His uncle was a PhD who studied in Japan, and his younger uncle was a teacher. His father, Li Yunjing, had also been an elementary school teacher. Later, he went to Southeast Asia to do business, then worked as a shop clerk, then returned to Chaozhou to work as a cashier, and then went back to teaching again. In today's terms, he repeatedly ventured into business and repeatedly returned to stable work. He went from elementary school to middle school, from teacher to principal. He served as principal at several different schools. It was during his time as a school principal, in 1928, that Li Ka-shing was born. His birthplace was Chaoan County, Chaozhou, Guangdong Province. There's a story that his childhood name was Li Yulin, which means encountering sweet rain after a drought. Of course, this name hasn't been fully verified. But one thing we can be fairly certain of is that when he was young, his playmates all called him Big Head Li. His head was just a bit on the larger side, wide at the top, sort of an inverted trapezoid shape. Looking at photos of him as a teenager, his whole head was indeed quite round, but he had very delicate features. He was an excellent student as a child, loved reading, and was incredibly hardworking, but he didn't catch a good time. In June 1939, Japanese forces bombed Chaozhou. When the flames of war arrived, Li Ka-shing was only 11 years old. A perfectly respectable scholarly family, torn apart just like that. Truth be told, besides the chaos of war, there was another small reason that forced them to leave. Among Li Yunjing's elder relatives and friends, there was someone who had grown rather close to the Japanese. The Japanese appointed him to an official position in the area. This man had some connection with Li Yunjing and knew he was extraordinarily learned, a great Confucian scholar. He kept trying to recruit him come work for the Japanese. After all, you can make a living anywhere. Li Yunjing refused. No matter what, he'd rather die than do it. To avoid unnecessary trouble, in the autumn of 1940, 12-year-old Li Ka-shing followed his father. The whole family fled as refugees to Hong Kong. From Chaozhou to Hong Kong, they trekked over mountains and rivers, traveling day and night, eating when hungry and drinking when thirsty, sleeping out in the open wilderness, threading through one Japanese blockade line after another. The 6 of them, Li Ka-shing, his father, his mother, his 2 younger brothers, and 1 younger sister, first went to stay with Li Yunjing's younger brother, who was Li Ka-shing's uncle. But his uncle, being a teacher, didn't make much money, barely enough to support his own family. You're talking about adding 6 more people. So they quickly moved on to seek refuge with another family. This time, they sought refuge with Li Ka-shing's mother's younger brother, Cheung. This person was very important. In the first half of Li Ka-shing's life, he was a figure who appeared repeatedly, yet always remained an enigmatic and ambiguous figure. Cheung ventured out into the world right after finishing elementary school. He started as a bank apprentice in Guangzhou and gradually worked his way up to manager. Later, he went into trade on his own and at age 27 made his way to Hong Kong, starting with a small family workshop making watch straps. Bit by bit, he built his way up to becoming the owner of Zhongnan Watch Company. In the eyes of Chaozhou people at the time, Cheung had already become one of the notable figures among Hong Kong's Chaozhou merchants. Not enormously wealthy, but definitely someone of standing and reputation. After the family reunited with Cheung, his uncle did indeed help them out. At first, he arranged for them to stay in the warehouse of the watch shop, and later rented a house for them outside. He also asked someone to help Li Ka-shing's father find a bookkeeping job at a trading company. But there's another version of the story originally. Since your brother-in-law ran his own company, why not just give your brother-in-law a job? But he never mentioned it at all. Even Li Ka-shing's mother was getting furious about it. But Li Ka-shing's father held her back. Let's not rely on others. We still have to rely on ourselves. At that time, schools in Hong Kong mainly taught in English, while Cantonese was spoken on the streets. This family from Chaozhou couldn't communicate at all. They didn't speak the language. When Li Ka-shing went to school, every single day felt like listening to complete gibberish. But this kid studied like crazy. With absolute obsession, like a man possessed, he learned Cantonese and English. On one hand, he was sensible and mature. On the other hand, it was incredibly difficult for the family to afford his education. This was money scraped together only through the whole family's extreme frugality. Later on, his mother took his younger siblings back to Chaozhou. It wasn't that they didn't want to stay together. It was that they simply couldn't survive the conditions forced them to split up the family. Only he and his father remained in Hong Kong, with his father scrimping and saving to put him through school. And that little bit of money was just barely enough to pay for his schooling. His father developed tuberculosis but couldn't bear to seek treatment. He refused to be hospitalized, and even when the hospital gave him a prescription, he wouldn't go to the pharmacy to buy the medicine. In those days, if your family didn't have deep enough pockets, getting tuberculosis and wanting to survive was nearly impossible, just like certain critical illnesses today. No money meant waiting to die. In 1943, Li Yunjing passed away. He'd only been in Hong Kong a few years. Looking at his photograph, such an exceptionally refined and scholarly person, with the bearing of a great Confucian scholar, and just like that, he was gone. Left behind was a 15-year-old boy in a foreign land amidst the chaos of war, facing the world all alone. The worst was yet to come. Shortly after his father passed away, Li Ka-shing discovered he was also starting to cough, and there was blood in his phlegm. The symptoms were exactly the same as his father's. He went for an X-ray. His lungs were full of holes, all already calcified. He coughed up blood over and over again, so many times. In his own words later, "In the morning there was blood in my phlegm. By afternoon I had a fever, went to get an X-ray. The X-ray revealed numerous holes in my lungs, all calcified. I coughed up blood repeatedly, over and over. It's truly heartbreaking and desolate. You can't help but feel the sorrow." 15 years old, family fortune collapsed, drifting in a foreign land, lost his father in his youth. And he himself was suffering from a serious illness. His father had died from the very same disease. So if he had the same illness, was he destined to follow the same path? The popular version of the story goes like this. He scavenged some medical books from old bookstalls and taught himself to heal himself. Every morning he would climb to the mountaintop to breathe the fresh air, shout loudly, and exercise his lung capacity. When he caught a cold, he'd drink salt water to fight the inflammation. He'd go to restaurants and write letters for the chefs, trading his services for a bowl of fish soup to get some nutrition. Just relying on these folk remedies like that. A year later, his tuberculosis miraculously healed. Doesn't this story sound a bit too fresh? Too legendary? But we don't have any other version of the story anyway. So just take it as true, haha. Years later, when he reflected on that period, he said something I think is worth remembering. He said, "This was the most difficult moment of my entire life. I told myself I couldn't die. As the eldest son, for my mother and younger siblings, for my future, I had to survive. I have to do my job well." A 15-year-old boy with just 4 words, "I cannot die," withstood fate's cruelest blow. But surviving was only the first step. His father was gone. He couldn't continue school anymore, couldn't afford the tuition, so he dropped out. He started working odd jobs. He later said, in his own words, "Because of the change in circumstances, poverty bred in him a fierce determination, which was to make money." You could say the driving force behind his relentless entrepreneurship came with the changes in his environment. Sounds like a school essay, but when you understand his situation at the time, you can truly feel behind these compositions an almost instinctive, the desperate, almost animal-like will to survive. And getting a job wasn't something you could just decide to do. He searched for work for quite a while, with no takers. At this moment, his uncle Zhuang Jing'an stepped forward. "Forget it. Come work for me then." Also, but Li Ka-shing didn't accept the offer. He discussed it with his mother. "Let me look for 3 more days. If I still can't find a job within these 3 days, then I'll go to my uncle's place. If I can't find a job within these 3 days, I'll go work for uncle." Guess what happened during those 3 days? He actually found one. Let's continue. In those final days, Li Ka-shing found himself in the center of Sai Ying-pun Main Street in Hong Kong, found a job as a waiter at a place called Chun Ming Grand Teahouse. Being a waiter at a teahouse was actually a skilled trade back in those days, with its own rules and techniques. Calling out in Cantonese, "We've got a large table upstairs, 2 honored guests. Right this way, please." But this work really wasn't easy to do. There was an industry rule back then for apprentice waiters. Let me recite it for you. It was particularly long. "Rise at dawn. Attend to the proprietor. 5 teapots and 4 handles. By my side all day long. Meticulous in every detail. Cautious and careful in all things." When customers came in, he treated them courteously, making no distinction between young and old, never judging by appearance, reading their expressions carefully, always careful not to give offense. Mastering the business, grasping its essence, abacus formulas must be memorized until fluent, practicing when there's work, silently reciting when idle, learning to apply what's learned, never complaining. At each year's end, they had to pass the test, their greatest fear being fired and sent packing. You see how hard it was before, how much suffering they endured. Yet, in the end, what they feared most was still getting fired. And for this one job, you still had to fight to keep it. Working over 15 hours every single day. He later recalled those days saying, "I'd head to work under the stars and moon and return home when thousands of lights were already glowing. Back then, my greatest wish was to be able to sleep soundly for 3 whole days and nights. But as tough as it was, This experience trained him in one extremely important skill: reading people. He came into contact with all walks of life. Working as a Teahouse server, reading people was the basic skill of the trade. After becoming experienced, he knew the regular customer's consumption needs and habits inside out. One glance, and he'd know exactly what each person wanted: who loved shrimp dumplings, who preferred shumai, who likes rice rolls dipped in sugar. Even when a new customer showed up, one glance at their outfit and bearing, and you could pretty much nail it right away and know exactly how to serve them. Reaching this level of skill, to put it jokingly, it's pretty much like those fortune tellers who set up street stalls. It's all about reading people to make a living. And he did this job for over a year. Then he quit. They never publicly explained the reason for his resignation. Maybe it was too grueling and they wanted to catch their breath at their uncle's place. Or perhaps they felt they'd learned everything there was to learn. He'd already hit the ceiling here and wanted a bigger stage. Anyway, in the end, he still went to his uncle Zhuang Jing'an's Zhongnan Watch Company. Once he got to his uncle's place, his learning ability really showed itself. Just watching from the side, just watching, in less than half a year, he had completely mastered the assembly and repair of all different watch models. And at the same time, he also completed his middle school curriculum through self-study. How did he manage to teach himself? He'd go to used bookstalls, buy school textbooks, finish reading them, then sell them back and use that money to buy the next one. Using this cheapest, most economical method, he created his own night school. But he didn't stay long at his uncle's place either. After about a year or so, he jumped ship again. Why? 2 reasons. One was that my uncle had a rule for new apprentices: they couldn't work on watch repairs until they'd been there for 3 years. So they couldn't become master craftsmen. Even though he had learned everything, he still couldn't work at the counter. This is like the rules in many traditional trades. I have to keep you down first. It's not like you can just go on stage because you've learned the skills. Another reason was that he wasn't very optimistic about the future prospects of the watch industry anymore. Of course, the various biographies out there also claim that before he left, he pointed his uncle toward a clear path. You can't just rely on watch repair. You need to expand your product range. Then, his uncle followed the advice. And sure enough, the business took off later on. We're not going to believe that story, it's just too legendary. But the real trigger for changing jobs had another hidden reason: he had fallen for his cousin. His cousin's name was Cheung Yuet-ming, daughter of Cheung Ching-on. Their connection began through learning. He studied Cantonese and English from his cousin. His cousin learned traditional culture from him. You teach me, I teach you, back and forth like that, and feelings started to develop between them. When the parents found out about this, his uncle didn't approve, and his mother didn't seem to approve either. It wasn't necessarily because they were relatives in the traditional customs of the Chaoshan region. They didn't seem to be against this kind of thing. The more likely reason was that back then, the gap in their social status was just too wide. In Zhuang Jing'an's mind, the ideal son-in-law should not be this poor nephew. Both sides threw up obstacles. But this cousin of his, as we'll mention later, she ended up waiting for him for over 20 years. At this point, the watch repair shop became unbearable, and his romantic pursuit had hit a wall. So Li Ka-shing left. Where did he go? This brings us to an important figure in his life, not some big shot. It was just a salesman he met at the Kowloon Peninsula Hotel while selling watches, named Li Jiamao. This name was identical to his surname, but they had no blood relation whatsoever. It was purely coincidental. Li Jiamao wasn't selling watches, he was selling galvanized iron buckets. 2 salesmen met by chance, and even though they were selling different things, they hit it off right away and had a great conversation. Later, Li Jiamao invited him to come visit his factory. When Li Ka-shing visited, he was shocked to discover that this man was actually the factory owner himself. He had assumed the man was just a salesman, but it turned out he owned a small factory himself. The thing is, Li Jiamao didn't look more than a few years older than him. This hit too hard. How could that guy pull it off? His insecurity became his driving force. If he can do it, so can I. Li Jiamao also extended an olive branch to him. Come, work for me. He thought it over and figured, all right then, I'll come over and learn. How did you manage to build up this little factory at such a young age? So he went and started selling galvanized iron buckets. But this person had a particular trait: he was exceptionally good at catching changes in the market. Before long, he noticed a trend. Iron barrels weren't selling well anymore. Why? A substitute product appeared on the market: plastic buckets. Plastic was starting to become popular. So he jumped ship again, from the hardware factory selling iron barrels to a plastics factory selling plastic barrels. At the plastics factory, he remained in sales, and once again, he excelled at it. And he didn't just bury his head in sales, he paid special attention to changes in the international plastics market. What products to launch, what products to phase out, how to adjust the product line. He gave his boss suggestions every single day. He also divided Hong Kong into several regions, made rounds through each area to understand the consumption levels and market conditions. He jotted down all his findings in a little notebook: which products should be sold in which regions, and roughly how much could be sold. He had it all figured out crystal clear. The boss saw this young man had what it takes and put him in charge of all company sales. He jumped straight to sales director. He was only 18 that year. After working another year, he turned 19. He had firmly secured the top sales position. His individual sales revenue was 7 times that of the second-place performer. Someone from outside tried to poach him. The boss panicked and immediately promoted him to factory general manager, even giving him 20% equity. 19 years old, general manager. But even after becoming general manager, he still often worked over 10 hours a day. His apartment building stopped running the elevator at 11 p.m. His exact words were, "I often have to climb the stairs when I get back to the apartment, all the way up to where I live, the 10th floor. Sometimes when he was utterly exhausted, he'd climb with his eyes closed, counting the stairs as he went up. When I'd counted enough steps, I'd open my eyes and I was there. Climbing the stairs with your eyes closed while counting. Just picture that scene." After becoming general manager, he didn't forget to keep learning, working during the day, attending night school in the evening. After passing the night school qualifying exam, he once considered going to university. Later, he probably took one look and thought, "Forget it, I'm making too much money, I'm not going." By this point, he had already made it. At 19, he became general manager, acquired shares in the factory, and earned enough to support his mother, 2 younger brothers, and a younger sister. Including their tuition and living expenses, no problem at all. This was the first truly significant breakthrough moment in Li Ka-shing's life, 1947 to 1948. Take a look at his photo from 1947, when he was promoted to general manager. At 19, with his hair slicked back, he looked at least 30. If you hadn't seen 1947 written at the bottom of the photo, you absolutely wouldn't believe this was someone not even 20 years old. But this was just the beginning. A dragon among men cannot be confined to a shallow pond. After another 2 years, Li Ka-shing couldn't sit still again. Next up, it was time to become his own boss. On May 1st, 1950, 22-year-old Li Ka-shing finally started his own business, opening his very first factory. Still doing plastics, Cheung Plastics Factory. But starting a business, how could it be that easy? He needed money. How much had he saved from those years as general manager? All the various accounts add up to roughly 7,000 to 7,500 Hong Kong dollars. This amount of money was nowhere near enough to start a factory. What to do? Borrow. He turned to his uncle, the elementary school teacher his family had initially sought refuge with all those years ago, and borrowed a portion from him. He borrowed some from his cousin. It's said that his uncle, Zhuang Jing'an, also contributed a portion. Scraping together money from here and there, they managed to pool together about 50,000 Hong Kong dollars. With just that amount, the Cheung Plastics Factory was established. Why name it Yangtze River? One theory is that it's taken from the meaning the Yangtze River doesn't reject small streams, which is why it can flow majestically for thousands of miles. Sounds quite bold and ambitious. But when Li Ka-shing himself was interviewed about this later, he gave a relatively modest explanation. He said, "Back then I appeared very humble on the surface, but deep down I was extremely proud and refused to submit to anyone. I chose this name hoping it would help me become more calm and settled." The key point isn't in mighty and boundless for 10,000 miles, but in the first half of the phrase, accepting all streams without discrimination. I'll take whatever comes my way, no picking, no choosing, no looking down on anything. I won't go around with my nose in the air, thinking I'm too good for everyone. This explanation is far more truthful than that bold and heroic version. Inside this humility, there's actually a hidden, fierce determination. In fact, his nature was absolutely competitive. There's a small detail when he first arrived in Hong Kong. At 12 or 13 years old, he couldn't stand being behind others, even just walking down the street. Whenever he saw pedestrians ahead, he wanted to pass them. Subconsciously, always felt, I can't fall behind others, and developed the habit of walking faster than everyone else. The factory had just $50,000 total, so we had to be frugal with every penny. They chose a location in a place called Shao Kei Wan in the northeastern corner of Hong Kong Island. The factory they found was run down and dilapidated, crumbling and collapsing, with rain leaking through the roof. When the factory opened for business, aside from the Cheung Plastics Factory sign, which was new, everything else was second-hand. The machinery and equipment were all second-hand goods he'd scrounged up from who knows where, bought at the lowest possible prices. But he'd already been in the plastics industry for several years and knew the business inside out, so with just a little fixing up, the equipment was good to go. He could not only repair them, but build them too. Once, he saw in a famous American industry magazine called Modern Plastics. He saw a very advanced machine, but he couldn't afford it. So, what did he do? He built one himself. After Dabley, he put together a small team and reverse-engineered a stripped-down version. Though quite basic, it worked. The cost was only 1/10 of the original. What did the factory produce? Water buckets, plastic shower heads, watering cans, belts, that's right, plastic toys. You'd find it hard to imagine, right? And all sorts of plastic household items too. With just these things, he slowly built up the factory. But what truly changed his fate was an accidental discovery in 1956. It was that same magazine again, Modern Plastics. While flipping through the magazine, he spotted a particularly small piece of news. There was a company in Italy was making plastic flowers from plastic raw materials, and they were selling like hotcakes in European and American markets. Plastic flowers, put simply, are artificial flowers. Now, when you hear the words plastic flowers, you might think it sounds a bit tacky, but back in those days, plastic represented new technology, new materials. It was a symbol of being modern and sophisticated. And at that time, living conditions had just started to improve a little bit. Ordinary people had this desire to enhance their quality of life, but they couldn't afford fresh flowers. Plastic flowers perfectly filled that gap. Li Ka-shing saw it. This was a business opportunity. But the problem was, what he'd been making before were pots and jars making flowers was a completely different ballgame. The machinery, formulas, and production processes were completely beyond his understanding. At that moment, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He bought a plane ticket and flew straight to Milan, Italy. Once he got there, he cut straight to the chase. "Hello, I'm a small business owner from Hong Kong. I want to buy your plastic flower manufacturing technology." They said, "Sure, we can do a technology transfer." The complete set of production process design blueprints, even after the discount, several $1 million. His factory started with just a few tens of thousands of dollars in total. Millions of dollars? If he sold everything he owned, he might have a few $100,000 Hong Kong dollars at most. He couldn't afford it. But Li Ka-shing wasn't the type to give up easily. There's an old saying that goes, "Since you've already come all this way," he couldn't possibly return empty-handed. If he couldn't afford to buy, he could steal the knowledge. Rumor has it, he went to apply for a factory floor job. Some say he worked as a material handler, others say he was a janitor. Either way, whatever his role was, he got in. Every day he'd push a little cart back and forth between the workshops, watching people work as he went, chatting people up and getting friendly with them. When he didn't understand something, he'd just ask, "How does this work? Come on, tell me about it." After watching, he'd go back to the hotel at night and sketch it all out in his little notebook. If he really couldn't get the answers through asking, he'd treat people to dinner after work. Under the pretext of, "I want to apply for a technical position at another factory. Could you teach me how?" Code. Notice the key point. It's a different factory. Once they heard it wasn't a competitor, they felt comfortable teaching him. He didn't work in sales for nothing. Dealing with people, figuring out what makes them tick, that was his specialty. With this approach, they even figured out the equipment and understood the technical processes. Even the techniques became clear. Is this actually realistic? To be honest, it's hard to say, but that's the story everyone tells, that he mastered it all in just over 2 months. Before leaving, he bought up every single artificial flower available in the local market, packed them all up and took them back as samples to study carefully. After returning to Hong Kong, he immediately assembled a 9-person research team, and they worked around the clock. From color matching to mold making, from formulas to machinery, step by step they worked through it all. And eventually, he actually pulled it off. The quality was just so-so after all. It was learned by watching and memorizing, but it worked. It was good enough. But where Li Ka-shing truly excelled wasn't in technical breakthroughs, but in business strategy. Once the flowers were made, how should they be positioned? High-end or low-end? His brain trust all said, definitely position it as high-end. First secure the high-end market, then move downward, a downward strike. Li Ka-shing said no. We must target the low end. Focus on ordinary people. His reasoning was crystal clear. On one hand, his own quality standards couldn't meet high-end requirements. On the other hand, the lower-tier market has a massive base. If you only target the high end, others will see the profit potential and immediately copy you. By the time you try to move down market, the low-end segment will have already been captured by others. So, you must capture the entire lower-tier market right from the start. Strike silently until the moment to stun the world arrives. Stay still until it's time to move with the force of thunder. He wasn't in a rush to launch. On one hand, mass producing, on the other hand, stockpiling inventory. The goal was to achieve instant launch, comprehensive rollout, leaving no time window for anyone to copy it. Everything was ready, we just needed that final push. But right when we were about to score, a problem popped up. He got word that Lane Crawford, Hong Kong's most prestigious British department store at the time, had partnered with the legitimate Italian manufacturer and was preparing to launch high-end plastic flowers. The launch date was already set. Li Ka-shing heard this and said absolutely not. After all that bowing and kowtowing, they couldn't drop the ball at the final step. He immediately ordered the date changed. They had to get ahead of Lane Crawford. Launched 4 days ahead of them and rolled out across the board. The result? An instant smash hit. Anyone in Hong Kong who could afford it was willing to buy his plastic flowers. Look at the finished products he made back then. The colors were blended beautifully, with gradient effects. The color transition on the leaves especially tests the skill of two-color injection molding technology. Behind this, he had personally tackled the technical challenges and even written papers, inventing the two-color injection molding method. When the authentic high-end products from Italy finally came out, they cost more than twice as much as his. Regular consumers definitely won't consider the expensive ones anymore. He's already captured their perception ahead of time. Besides getting the low-end strategy right by rushing to market first, he also did something else right. He invested tremendous energy into training the frontline salespeople. He taught them how to introduce the products, gave them little red envelopes and small gifts, and got them to say good things about his products in front of customers. This is very important. Not only did his own sales team need to know how to pitch to B2B clients, but the frontline sales staff also had to handle consumer questions smoothly. They also had to be able to answer customers' questions fluently. There was one buyer who originally came looking for high-end Italian products. When he asked the staff there, they didn't know anything. The product descriptions weren't detailed either. Turning to look at the Yanks of plastic flowers beside them, the salesperson introduced them like treasured possessions. What technology we use, who our boss is, where our factory is located. Even went as far as to say, if you have time, the factory can send someone to pick you up and take you for a visit. And that's how the brand culture gets passed on. The person was just casually browsing at first, but after being moved by this wave of service, he actually went and toured Cheung's factory. He happened to catch Li Ka-shing at a time when cash flow was tight. The company had just gone public and was so hot that operations couldn't keep up. This deal sealed the path ahead wide open. But the story wasn't over yet. When good times come too quickly, disaster follows close behind. Orders flooded in like a tidal wave, so many they couldn't keep up with production. What to do? He got a bit carried away at the time. Just take them first and figure it out later. Only an idiot would turn down money. The result? They really couldn't meet production. Workers were doing overtime every single day, mentally breaking down. The only option was to cut corners and speed things up. Could Li Ka-shing see this happening? He could, but at the time, he was pretty much at a loss himself. He even began to doubt himself. Am I being too cautious, too careful? What's the harm in slightly lower quality? Weren't orders still flooding in anyway? He wavered. He didn't stick to his original principles. Mass returns began. Customers lined up at his door demanding refunds. What kind of garbage are you producing? We're never working with you again. Downstream distributors returned goods. Upstream material suppliers demanded payment. And banks, always the first to smell trouble, kept showing up to collect debts. The Cheung plastics factory was pushed nearly to the brink of bankruptcy. No matter how well you build your brand, if the product fails, it's all for nothing. 1. In the end, it all comes down to quality. But the way Li Ka-shing handled this crisis, that's where his true brilliance really showed. He threw a combination punch-slashing production capacity and streamlining the workforce. He let go of those who weren't up to par and those who didn't take their work seriously. He kept the reliable people and raised the quality standards. Established stricter quality control procedures. Product qualification rates were directly tied to worker compensation using economic incentives to ensure product quality. What about the huge pile of defective products sitting in stock? What could be sold was dumped at low prices as defective goods, cleared out to second-hand dealers to recover at least some of the cash first. Those that couldn't even be sold as defective goods were melted down and recast. Once they had dealt with their own internal issues, the hardest step arrived, going door to door, visiting the banks, raw material suppliers, visiting clients one by one, offering sincere apologies with utmost humility, admitting mistakes and begging for forgiveness, laying out all the problems without hiding anything, making everything crystal clear, and made a promise. If you suffer any losses because of me, I will bear all of them. I'll compensate you in full for any damages. If you want a refund, I'll return every penny, no questions asked. But if you're still willing to trust that I can get this right, and you'd like an exchange instead, I absolutely guarantee the quality. When you're in business, how things go when times are good is one thing. What really tests you is how you handle problems when they arise. A good portion of people chose to forgive him because he was candid enough. Most of his clients made concessions to varying degrees, which allowed him to catch his breath and get through the crisis. After the crisis was resolved, Cheung Plastics Factory turned around and started climbing upward again. They opened branch factories and came back from the brink of death. At this point, those opportunistic competitors who had tried to swoop in and grab a piece of the pie when he was down couldn't sit still anymore. They hired reporters to go after him, sent them to photograph his rundown factory, dug up his entire job-hopping history from back in the day when he was switching companies every single year. Look at this rundown factory. Can anything good actually come out of a place like this? Someone so young who's already jumped between jobs multiple times, can a person with so little perseverance really make a good product? Once the newspaper published that story, it had quite an impact on him. What was he going to do? He went straight to the newspaper office with a bag full of products on his back to confront the editor-in-chief. The gist of it was sure. What you reported isn't entirely wrong. My factory is a mess. And yes, people keep leaving. But have you actually seen my products? Just open the sack and lay them out right there. The book says when the president over there saw the product, it really was good. He was moved. So they sent reporters to his factory to do a proper shoot. The factory was shown exactly as it was, but the products were filmed crystal clear. Later came that report. Brilliant flowers bloom in a shabby factory. The industrial miracle of Hong Kong, created by Li Ka-shing. Using 4 ounces to move 1,000 pounds, he turned a smear campaign into free publicity. Of course, there's a prerequisite for this: good wine needs no bush. The product was genuinely good, which is why he dared to do this. If your product isn't good, you could carry 10 bags and it still wouldn't make a difference. After the plastic flowers took off, business wasn't just booming in Hong Kong and expanded internationally. They started receiving overseas orders. One of them was a huge American order, and the story behind it is particularly interesting. America's largest plastic flower importer came knocking right on his door. You're the largest plastic flower manufacturer in Hong Kong. Your products are absolutely top-notch, and I want yours and only yours. Li Ka-shing was completely stunned when he heard this. How are we the biggest in Hong Kong? Look at my rundown factory. So, how did this reputation even get out there? Well, for that, we need to go back a bit. In 1955, the year before he started making plastic flowers, there was an American Jewish client named Masur. He placed an order with him for a batch of plastic toys. At that time, he had a production line for plastic toys, but the output wasn't very large. But when it came time for delivery, Masur broke the contract and refused to take the goods. According to the contract, he was supposed to pay compensation. But Li Ka-shing didn't make him pay the penalty. He later said in a documentary himself at the time, "This batch of goods wasn't hard to sell anyway, so there was no need to make things difficult for the guy. Let's build goodwill," told him. "If you have other business opportunities in the future, we can establish an even better relationship." He was selling a favor, and this American remembered it. After he went back, he advertised for him everywhere. "If you want to buy plastic flowers, go to Hong Kong and find Cheung. The plastic flowers from Cheung are excellent." This indirectly brought him quite a few orders from America, including the fact that America's largest artificial flower importer came knocking on his door. That was because of this connection. You see, when you plant good seeds far and wide, one day you'll reap good results. It's just that most of the time, when you're planting those seeds, you have no idea when the harvest will come. But landing this major client was just the first tiny step. They came specifically looking for Hong Kong's largest, and the question was, were we actually that? We weren't. They came because of the biggest in Hong Kong claim, but the question was, are you actually that? No, you're not. Back then, he was still just a small, run-down factory. So what could he do? Once people came for on-site inspections and saw his dilapidated factory, it wouldn't be top-notch. Instead, it was like a toad in the desert with nowhere to hide. Li Ka-shing made a desperate, all-or-nothing decision. The factory won't do? Get a new one. Move. Sounds simple, but the clients had already arrived, and the factory tour was scheduled in 1 week. In other words, he had to get everything sorted out within a week. So he rented a standard factory space in the most prosperous industrial building in North Point, Hong Kong, and immediately organized his team to move in. When the money wasn't enough, he took every asset that could be mortgaged and pledged them all to the bank for loans. This was the most rushed and most reckless decision he'd ever made in his life up to that point. Because if the client deal fell through in the end, all his investment would be like drawing water with a bamboo basket, completely wasted. 7 days and 7 nights. Terminating the lease on the old factory, leasing and renovating the new facility, relocating the old equipment, purchasing, installing, and debugging new equipment, adjusting positions for existing employees, recruiting and training new hires to get them on the job, and then everything moved into normal production operations, all wrapped up in 7 days. He slept only 3 to 4 hours each day. The client arrived, toured the new facility, and was very pleased. From that point on, Cheung became their exclusive supplier, a relationship that continued until 1969. And that American, Max, kept introducing him to other American clients. At that time, 80% of America's plastic flowers were imported from Hong Kong. Because Cheung secured major orders from the American market, it leaped to become one of the world's largest plastic flower manufacturers. According to relevant sources, at that time it should have been the second largest in the world. Li Ka-shing earned himself a nickname in the business world from then on, Hong Kong's Plastic Flower King. From 1956, when he started making plastic flowers, to 1958 in just 3 years. This was the fastest period of asset growth in Li Ka-shing's life. In 1957, the factory's profit was over 1 million Hong Kong dollars. In 1958, it exceeded 3 million Hong Kong dollars. From 1957 to 1964, the accumulated net profit was tens of millions of Hong Kong dollars. What kind of level was that? Let's put this in perspective. By 1959, Stanley Ho was doing extremely well in real estate in Hong Kong. At that time, he had built up a fortune of 10 million, which was already an astronomical figure in Hong Kong back then. And when Stanley Ho and his 3 partners won the bid for the Macau gaming license in 1962, the winning price was just over 3.1 million. In other words, Li Ka-shing's annual profit alone would have been enough to win the bid for a gambling license. He later said in an interview with Bloomberg, "The period when I made the most money, the fastest in my life, was when I was 28 or 29 years old. Before turning 30, I'd already made enough money so that my entire family would never have to work another day in their lives. This bowl of fish offal soup and the good karma it brought, totally worth it." So once the business grew, production capacity had to be expanded. Li Ka-shing rented large amounts of factory space in Shaoquan, San Po Kong in Kowloon, and other areas. But at that time, Hong Kong's economic structure was already transforming, shifting from an entrepot trading port toward local manufacturing. Factories were multiplying, and with real estate starting to develop, factory space couldn't keep up with demand. Rents kept climbing higher and higher. He did the math and realized renting wasn't as good as buying. In 1958, he decided to purchase land and build his own factory. He built Cheung Kong Building on the plot at 661 Kings Road and built the Cheung Kong Chai Wan Building on the lot at 18 Chung Li Street in Chai Wan. Both buildings were completed on the same day. Who was the VIP guest cutting the ribbon? It was the owner of America's largest plastic flower importer. Without him, there would have been no explosive growth for Cheung Kong later on. Li Ka-shing kept this debt of gratitude close to his heart. Before the two buildings were completed, Cheung Kong had over 3,000 workers. After completion, the number doubled, increasing to over 7,000 workers. At that time, there were roughly 30,000 workers making plastic flowers across all of Hong Kong, and about 1,000 plastic flower factories. Li Ka-shing's family alone accounted for a quarter of the total production capacity, while their number of factories represented just 1,000th of the total. He single-handedly rewrote the concentration of market leaders in the entire industry. But building these two towers wasn't just about expanding production capacity. He also had another little selfish motive. These two buildings weren't just for his own factory use. He also rented out a portion of them. This was his earliest entry point into real estate. Although his own properties were all for rent only, never for sale, renting them out didn't stretch the cash flow as tight as pre-selling off-plan units. Nor did it create such high debt ratios. The debt ratio stays high. It looks like the money doesn't come in fast enough, but basically, there won't be any major problems. And he had a special trick up his sleeve, hoarding land. Starting from the late 1950s, he quietly accumulated land and properties. On the surface, it was expanding factory space, but in reality, he was preparing the groundwork for future real estate ventures. You could even say he used industrial factory buildings as a cover. It's like how McDonald's appears to be selling burgers, but is actually in the real estate business. This covert operation tactic, during Hong Kong's real estate market crash from 1965 to 1967, he perfected to the ultimate degree. Here's what happened in 1962. Hong Kong revised its building regulations. The new regulation required that the same area of land could only accommodate 20% fewer buildings than before. So real estate developers desperately rushed to complete construction before the policy change took effect. In 1964, the real estate market in 65 boomed to the point of absolute madness. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry with even a bit of capability rushed in. Banks frantically competed for deposits and aggressively issued loans, with some banks even investing their own money directly into real estate. They went too hard, and the capital chain broke. In early 1965, within just half a month, 7 or 8 banks experienced runs. Even Hang Seng Bank nearly collapsed, and only survived thanks to a bailout from HSBC. The property market plummeted, with land and housing prices crashing. Anyone who ran too slow got buried in it. Just as they were catching their breath, just as things were starting to settle down, 1,000 967 brought another wave of turmoil. The aftershocks of that decade-long turbulent period on the mainland had reached Hong Kong. The various movements created widespread panic and anxiety. Many businessmen greased their heels and fled, taking their assets with them, dumping their properties at bargain prices, and emigrating immediately. Under these two waves of assault, Hong Kong's real estate asset prices plummeted to rock bottom. At this point, Li Ka-shing began buying at the bottom, going against the tide. He had a judgment all of this was temporary. Hong Kong's future prospects were bright. Whether this judgment came from being well-informed or from conviction, the result was he boldly bought up vast amounts of land and properties at low prices. He bought land to build properties for rent and purchased buildings to renovate and lease out. Within 3 years, the storm subsided and the property market recovered. Those who had fled came back to buy assets again, but prices had already climbed back up. By the early 1970s, Cheung already owned over 600,000 square feet of property. Just from rental income alone, he collected 4 million Hong Kong dollars every year. He once said something. I think it's worth remembering. I won't rush to buy up a lot of land just because the real estate market looks good today, profiting from buying and selling properties. I look at the big picture, the mortgage situation, citizens' income and expenditures, the outlook for the global economy. Before I make any major decision, I take a cautious approach and consult with all relevant parties. But once I've decided on a course of action, I won't change it. From 1959 to 1980, over a span of 20 years, the price of industrial land in Hong Kong skyrocketed 280 times, and residential land prices soared 82 times. Just imagine how many times the value of all that land he'd been hoarding multiplied. Now, at this point, we need to talk about his love life. Because we've reached that stage in his story, it was about time for him to get married. He didn't marry until he was 35. Stanley Ho got married at 21, Henry Fok at 22, and him, 35 years old. Who did he marry? Still, his cousin, Cheung Ming. Yes, that very cousin he'd had his eye on since his teens. The two of them were in a relationship for over 20 years. Why did it take so long? Basically, it was because the family didn't approve. Ming Pao Weekly once published an article titled The Love Story of Li Ka-shing and Cheung Ming. In the circles of Chaozhou people in Hong Kong, there's a beloved story that goes like this. A young woman from a prestigious family fell in love and married her penniless cousin, defying her father's fierce opposition. Fell in love with and married her poor cousin. With his cousin's strong support and encouragement, the older cousin worked tirelessly and finally made something of himself. There's another story in his early years. When Li Ka-shing left the Chung Nam Watch Company, he went against his uncle's kind intentions. During the difficult entrepreneurial journey that followed, Zhuang Jing'an rarely offered him any help. But when the Cheung Company encountered the product return crisis in its early days, Zhuang Jing'an actually did extend a helping hand, helping him through that crisis. Zhuang Yueming also secretly sold her gold and silver jewelry to quietly support her cousin. But there was also a completely different voice. British journalist Joe Studwell, a man who'd spent some 10-20 years digging deep into Asian journalism, wrote a book called Asian Godfathers. He had interviewed these tycoons in Hong Kong. He wrote bluntly in the book, in Hong Kong, Asia's richest man, Li Ka-shing, always likes to say he's the son of a teacher. His father arrived in Hong Kong in 1940 penniless. But in truth, he became an important tycoon, in part because he married the boss's daughter. The business Li Ka-shing ran actually belonged to his father-in-law, and Li Ka-shing simply developed it further. According to an old friend of Li Ka-shing, his mother-in-law also provided him with additional financial support. You see, the exact same piece of history can be told as two completely different stories. One is a poor boy who made it on his own merits from nothing. The other is he only got his start by marrying the boss's daughter. So which one is true? Perhaps there's some truth to both sides. History is never black and white. But regardless, in 1963, the 35-year-old Li Ka-shing married the 31-year-old Cheung Ming. He spent $630,000 of fortune at the time to purchase the luxury mansion at 79 Deepwater Bay Road. The view from the peak was spectacular, and right next door at number 77 lived the shipping magnate Pao Yukong. Li Ka-shing said he continued living in this house for decades. The following year, Zhuang Yueling gave birth to his eldest son, Victor Li Tsar-Kwoi, and 2 years later, his younger son, Richard Li Tsar-Kai. The family of four was now complete. In 1958, Cheung Plastics Factory was renamed Cheung Industrial Company Limited. Li Ka-shing became chairman and general manager, but he didn't stay in the plastic flower business for too long. From the 1960s onward, the plastic flower industry started going downhill. He saw this trend ahead of time, just like years before, when he'd seen that metal buckets would be replaced by plastic ones. This man was always looking at the next move. He started shifting his focus toward plastic toys. By 1964, Cheung Kong's toy exports had already reached over 50 million Hong Kong dollars, with profits approaching 10 million. His biggest client had shifted from American plastic flower importers to the renowned American toy giant Hasbro. Yes, that Hasbro, the one behind Transformers and My Little Pony. In a way, plastic toys saved Cheung Kong once again. Because by the late 1960s, plastic flower manufacturers began going bankrupt in waves. The former global king of plastic flowers closed its doors for good in May 1967 inches. The end. Even their headquarters building was sold to Cheung Kong. But Li Ka-shing was able to survive, not because he was smarter than others, but because he sensed the scent of danger earlier than others and made the decision to pivot sooner. In June 1971, he simply changed the name of Cheung Kong Industries Limited to Cheung Kong Real Estate Limited, making it crystal clear to everyone. His core business was shifting to real estate. No more hiding it. A year later, at the end of July 1972, the company was renamed once again to Cheung Kong Holdings Limited. This became the Cheung Kong that everyone would later come to know. In November 1972, Cheung Kong Holdings was listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. At the time, Hong Kong media grouped together 5 Chinese-owned real estate companies that went public that same year: Cheung Kong Holdings, Sun Hung Kai Properties, Hopewell Holdings, Hang Lung Properties, and New World Development, collectively known as the 5 Tigers of Chinese property developers. Among these 5 tigers, Cheung Kong Holdings wasn't the most outstanding at first. In terms of industry seniority, it couldn't match New World or Hang Lung. In terms of professional qualifications, he couldn't match Hopewell Holdings' Gordon Wu, a Princeton University-educated architect. He personally reviewed many of the projects. In terms of financial strength, they weren't as strong as several other companies at the time either. But starting from the latter half of the 1970s, Cheung Kong began to stand out from the crowd. By the mid-1980s, it had already become the leader of the 5 tigers. At this point, in anyone else's story, this would already be the climax. Becoming CEO, marrying a beautiful rich woman, end quote. Reaching the pinnacle of life, climax moment. But in Li Ka-shing's script, this was merely the opening act. The reason people truly remember the name Li Ka-shing isn't because of plastic flowers, and it isn't because he was the leader of the 5 tigers. It wasn't even because he had earned enough money to last several lifetimes before he turned 30, but rather because of what he did next. something that, at the time, seemed like nothing short of suicide. 1977. Hong Kong Central. 49-year-old Li Ka-shing stood in the shadow of the Hong Kong Land building, a symbol of British power. He squinted and stared at it for a moment. The person beside him asked, "Mr. Li, Hong Kong Land is the landlord of Central. It's easier to move a mountain than to shake Hong Kong Land. Are we really going to compete with them for this land? Are we really going to compete with them for this land?" Li Ka-shing didn't answer directly. He simply smiled faintly and said something that would later send chills down the spine of Hong Kong's entire business community. "What they value is the land. What I value is timing. Starting from Central Station, I want them to know that this era has changed hands." A man who started out making plastic flowers with capital less than 1/10 of his opponents, yet wanted to kick out Asia's oldest British conglomerate from their own private backyard. Was he crazy? Maybe so. But over 30 years ago, when a 15-year-old boy lay in a hospital bed coughing up blood, some people thought he wouldn't make it through that winter. And what happened? Not only did he survive, but he grabbed fate by the throat. And now, those hands he had prepared were quietly reaching toward the entire British-owned Hong Kong conglomerate Wharf, Hutchison, Whampoa, and even land itself. So how did he pull off this snake swallowing an elephant? How did he get the taipan of HSBC to willingly lend him the money? Stay tuned to The Soft Crash, and we'll tell you all about it in the next episode.